The news did not arrive gently. It crashed into the quiet morning like thunder. A terrible accident. Robert Downey Jr., the man whose voice, wit, and presence had filled cinema screens for decades, had been involved in a catastrophic crash. The words spread in fragments at first, whispered through urgent phone calls and flashing notifications. Critical condition, severe accident, uncertain outcome, and somewhere far away from the flashing lights and the gathering crowd, a phone rang inside a quiet home. Susan Downey answered. For a moment, she did not understand what she was hearing. The voice on the other end spoke carefully, slowly, as if every syllable had weight. There has been an accident. Outside, the world was still moving normally. Cars passed. Morning sunlight slid across the floor. But inside that moment, everything seemed to stop. The accident had happened only hours earlier. Robert had been traveling, the road stretching long and empty beneath a pale sky. Witnesses later said the scene felt unreal. Twisted metal, broken glass reflecting sunlight like scattered mirrors, the distant echo of sirens approaching fast. Emergency crews worked in silence, moving quickly, carefully, as cameras and strangers gathered at the edge of the scene. No one spoke his name out loud at first, but everyone already knew, because even in that moment, the face inside the wrecked vehicle was unmistakable. Robert Downey Jr., the actor who had once resurrected his own life from chaos, the man who had become Iron Man, the man who had learned to laugh at the darkest chapters of his past. Now he lay still as paramedics worked around him. The sirens carried him away, and somewhere across the city, Susan was already on her way. Those who saw her later would remember the silence. Not the chaos of reporters or the flashing cameras outside the hospital entrance, but the quiet determination in her steps as she walked through the doors. The corridors smelled faintly of antiseptic and cold air. Doctors moved quickly. Nurses whispered. Machines hummed. Inside a small room, time slowed. Robert lay surrounded by monitors and soft white light. The man who had once filled arenas with applause now rested in a fragile stillness that felt impossible to comprehend. His face, familiar to millions, looked peaceful, almost as if he were simply sleeping after a long journey. Susan stood beside the bed. For a long time she said nothing. Their life together had always been something extraordinary. They had built it carefully, piece by piece, through years of recovery, second chances, and quiet victories. She had seen the man behind the legend, the husband who told ridiculous jokes at breakfast, the father who turned ordinary afternoons into adventures for their children. Now the room felt unbearably small. Soon their children arrived. The hospital hallway grew heavy with emotion. Footsteps slowed. Voices faded. Family members held each other in silence as they waited for answers that never seemed to come quickly enough. One of the nurses later said the children kept looking toward the door, as if expecting their father to suddenly walk in with one of his playful smiles, ready to explain that the whole situation was just an elaborate misunderstanding. But the machines continued their quiet rhythm. Hours passed. Outside, the world had already begun reacting. News outlets broke the story. Headlines appeared across every screen. Fans gathered online in disbelief. Messages flooded social media. Memories, gratitude, shock. For millions of people, Robert Downey Jr. was not just an actor. He was a symbol of resilience. A man who had fallen harder than most, and somehow risen again. It felt impossible that a single moment, could suddenly silence such a voice. Inside the hospital room, however, fame meant nothing. There was only family. Susan held his hand. The children stood close, whispering things that only he was meant to hear. Small stories, private memories, fragments of laughter from years that now felt suddenly fragile. Doctors came and went. The machines continued their steady tone. At times, the room seemed almost peaceful, the sunlight slipping slowly through the window and resting gently across the bed. Outside the glass, the city moved forward. Traffic, voices, distant sirens, unaware that one of its brightest stars was fading behind a closed door. Susan leaned closer. Her voice was quiet. She spoke about the first time they met, about the strange, unpredictable life they had built together, about the films, the long nights, the laughter that had echoed through their home, and the children listened, because in that room, surrounded by the quiet rhythm of machines, they were no longer thinking about the world outside. The headlines, the cameras, the millions of strangers mourning a hero. They were simply a family, waiting, holding on to every second. As the afternoon light slowly began to fade, the hospital corridor grew quieter still. Nurses walked softly past the door. Somewhere in the distance, a monitor beeped faintly. The sky outside the window was beginning to darken, and inside that small room, Susan never let go of his hand, not even for a moment. The hospital room did not feel like a place where legends should end. It felt ordinary. Too ordinary. A narrow bed, a plastic chair near the wall, a small table holding a paper cup of coffee that had already gone cold. Outside the window, the late afternoon light turned soft and pale, the way it often does in Los Angeles before evening begins to settle over the city. Inside the room, Robert Downey Jr. lay very still, but the room was full of memories. Susan sat beside him, her hand resting lightly over his. His fingers were warm, though motionless, and for a moment she found herself staring at them. The same hands that had once held scripts late into the night, flipping through pages while pacing across their living room floor. Those hands had always been expressive. When Robert told stories, his hands moved constantly. When he joked, they punctuated every line. When he hugged his children, they wrapped around them with a warmth that made the world feel safe. Now they were quiet. On the chair beside the bed sat a jacket someone had brought earlier. Dark gray, slightly wrinkled. It still carried the faint scent of his cologne, the one he always wore before premieres, interviews, or even ordinary dinners out with the family. Susan reached for it without thinking. For a moment she simply held the sleeve between her fingers. It was such a small detail. But suddenly the room filled with echoes of ordinary life. Robert standing in the kitchen early in the morning, pouring coffee while humming some old song from the 70s. Robert pacing the hallway while rehearsing lines, occasionally stopping to ask Susan, "Too dramatic? Or just dramatic enough?" Robert laughing loudly when the kids beat him at board games. The memories came in fragments, tiny moments, the kind people rarely talk about when they describe a famous life. One of the children stepped closer to the bed. He looked at his father carefully, almost studying his face, as if trying to memorize every detail. The curve of his eyebrows, the faint lines near his eyes that had deepened over the years, the familiar calm expression that once carried so many different emotions on screen. "He looks like he's about to wake up," he said quietly. Susan nodded, though she didn't speak, because that thought had already crossed her mind many times. Robert had always been dramatic, even in ordinary situations. If he were awake now, he might have opened one eye, waited until everyone leaned closer, then suddenly sat up and said something ridiculous like, "Well, this is definitely not how I planned my Tuesday," and everyone would laugh. The nurses who passed the door earlier noticed something unusual about the room. There was no shouting, no chaos, only quiet. Occasionally Susan would lean closer and whisper something. A memory, a joke, a line from one of the many conversations they had shared over the years. On the small table near the window sat Robert's glasses. Someone had placed them there earlier. The thin metal frame reflected the fading sunlight. Susan picked them up carefully and turned them in her hands. She remembered the first time he wore those glasses at home. He had walked into the kitchen wearing them dramatically, pretending to be a serious professor giving a lecture about breakfast cereal. The kids had laughed so hard that morning. Robert loved moments like that. He loved turning ordinary mornings into small performances. Another quiet detail filled the room. The faint ticking sound of a watch. It belonged to Robert. A simple watch he had worn for years. Nothing flashy. Just something he liked because, as he once said, "It reminds me that time is something you're supposed to enjoy, not chase." Now the watch rested beside the glasses. Tick, tick, tick. Time continued to move forward, even though inside the room it felt frozen. Susan leaned closer again. "You remember Malibu?" she whispered softly. The words were almost carried away by the gentle hum of the machines. "That afternoon when you tried to cook for everyone and nearly burned the entire kitchen." One of the children smiled faintly. Robert had never been good at cooking, but he tried anyway. There was a warmth in those memories, something deeply human that existed far beyond movie sets and red carpets. Another nurse stepped quietly into the room for a brief moment, adjusting a monitor, checking numbers on a screen. She moved gently, almost respectfully, aware that she was standing inside a moment that belonged entirely to the family. When she left, the door closed softly. The room returned to its quiet rhythm. Outside, the sky had darkened into deep blue. City lights began appearing in the distance, one by one, like tiny stars waking up. Inside the room, Susan rested her head lightly against Robert's shoulder. Not to wake him, just to be close. The children sat nearby, each lost in their own memories. Moments of laughter, road trips, movie nights at home. The sound of their father's voice telling stories long after bedtime. None of them spoke for a while, because sometimes silence holds more memories than words ever could. The watch on the table continued its quiet ticking, and somewhere far beyond the hospital walls, the world kept moving, unaware of the thousands of small, ordinary moments that had once built the life of a man now lying quietly in a softly lit room. Night arrived slowly, not suddenly, just a gradual dimming of the light outside the hospital window until the sky became a deep, endless blue and the city lights began flickering on one after another. Inside the room, nothing seemed to move. The machines continued their steady rhythm. Soft beeps, low mechanical breaths, a quiet pattern repeating itself over and over again. Susan had not left her chair. Someone had brought her another cup of coffee hours earlier, but it sat untouched beside the window. The surface had gone still and cold. She barely noticed it. Her eyes remained on Robert. There was something strange about the stillness of his face. Not frightening, just unfamiliar. The man who had spent his entire life moving, speaking, laughing, improvising, was now surrounded by a silence that felt almost unreal. At times, Susan found herself watching closely, as if waiting for some tiny sign. A twitch of his fingers, a change in his breathing, anything. But the room kept its secrets. One of the doctors had spoken earlier in the hallway, away from the children. His voice had been calm, professional, but his words had carried a heaviness that Susan could feel long after the conversation ended. "His condition is complicated." Complicated? Such a strange word for something so enormous. When she returned to the room, she did not repeat the doctor's explanation. The children were sitting quietly beside the bed, their eyes drifting between the monitors and their father's face. They did not ask questions. Perhaps they were afraid of the answers. Outside the door, the hospital corridor had grown quieter. The rush of the day had faded, replaced by the slow rhythm of night shifts and distant footsteps. Inside the room, the air felt thick with memories. Robert's jacket still hung over the chair. His glasses rested on the table. The small watch beside them continued its quiet ticking. Tick, tick, tick. Susan reached out again, brushing her fingers across his hand. For a moment she thought she felt something, a faint warmth shifting beneath her touch. She froze. Her eyes lifted quickly to his face. Nothing changed. The machines continued their soft pattern, as indifferent and steady as before. Maybe it had only been her imagination, or maybe something else. No one spoke. The children seemed to sense the tension in the room. One of them leaned forward slightly, studying their father's face as if trying to read a message hidden somewhere in the lines of his expression. "He's strong," the younger one said quietly. Susan nodded again. Robert had always been strong in ways people rarely saw. Not just physically, but emotionally. He had fought through storms that most people could never imagine. Years earlier, when his life had seemed to collapse around him, many believed his story had already ended. But Robert had never followed predictable scripts. That was part of his strange magic. He reinvented himself, again and again. The thought lingered in the room like a quiet question no one dared ask out loud. Could he do it again? A sudden sound broke the stillness. Not loud, just a soft mechanical adjustment from one of the monitors. Everyone looked up at once. The green line on the screen moved steadily across the display, rising and falling in its familiar pattern. The machine beeped softly, exactly as it had all evening. But for a moment, the room felt different. Susan leaned closer. "Robert," she whispered. The word barely left her lips. No response came. Yet something about the atmosphere had shifted. Subtle. Almost impossible to describe. The children exchanged glances, unsure whether they had felt it too. One of the nurses passed the open doorway and paused briefly, looking inside. Her expression softened when she saw the family gathered around the bed. She did not interrupt. She simply continued walking down the quiet hallway. Inside the room, the night deepened. Outside the window, the city lights stretched across the horizon like a distant constellation. Susan looked at Robert again. His face seemed peaceful, almost thoughtful, as if he were listening to something far away, something no one else in the room could hear. She remembered something he had once said during a long drive years ago. "Life doesn't move in straight lines," Robert had joked. "It's more like improvisation. You think the scene is over, and then suddenly someone throws in a new line." At the time, they had both laughed. Now the words returned in a strange, quiet way. Susan rested her head beside his arm again. The watch on the table continued ticking. The machines hummed softly. The night outside the hospital grew deeper and quieter, and in the stillness of that small room, no one knew whether the story had truly reached its final moment, or if somewhere, hidden beneath the silence, another unexpected line was still waiting to be spoken. The night stretched quietly across the hospital. Not silent, never completely silent. There were always small sounds. The faint wheels of a trolley somewhere down the corridor. A distant elevator door opening and closing. The quiet murmur of nurses speaking softly at the end of the hallway. Inside the room, the light had dimmed. Only a small lamp near the wall remained on, casting a soft amber glow that spread gently across the floor. The machines continued their steady rhythm, each small beep slipping into the stillness like a heartbeat echoing through an empty space. Robert Downey Jr. lay motionless beneath the thin white sheets. From a distance, he could have been asleep. The kind of deep, exhausted sleep that follows a long day. Susan had not moved for a long time. Her chair remained pulled close to the bed, one hand resting over his. Every now and then, her thumb traced the faint lines across his knuckles. Slowly, almost unconsciously. It was a small habit she had developed years ago, back when they used to sit together on long flights between cities. Back when life felt fast and chaotic and full of premieres, scripts, interviews, late dinners. Robert would often fall asleep beside her on those flights, leaning slightly toward the window while she absent-mindedly traced circles across his hand. A quiet ritual. Now the movement returned again. Slow, gentle. The children had grown quieter as the hours passed. One of them sat by the window, looking out at the city lights scattered across the darkness. Another leaned back in the chair near the wall, eyes half closed, but not truly asleep. No one spoke. It felt as if words might disturb something fragile in the air. The watch on the table continued ticking. Tick, tick, tick. Time moved forward with quiet determination. Susan glanced toward the small objects resting beside the watch. Robert's glasses, folded neatly, the thin metal frame catching a faint reflection of light. She remembered the way he would sometimes push them up onto his forehead while thinking through a scene. "Wait," he would say suddenly. "I've got a better line." He always believed there was a better line, a better ending, another way the story could turn. Outside the hospital window, the city seemed endless. Cars moved like tiny streams of light along distant roads. Somewhere far away, a siren briefly cut through the night, before fading again. Inside the room, the air remained calm. Susan leaned forward slightly. For a moment, she studied Robert's face. There were details she had never noticed before. The faint silver strands in his hair near the temple. The soft crease beside his mouth. The one that appeared whenever he smiled. Millions of people had seen that smile, but very few had seen the quiet version of him, the version who woke early on Sunday mornings, the version who stood in the kitchen making coffee while the house was still asleep, the version who sometimes sat silently at the table, staring out the window as if thinking about something he never fully explained. Those moments had always belonged only to them. The younger child shifted slightly in the chair. "Mom," he said quietly. Susan turned. "Yeah? Do you think he can hear us?" The question hung in the air for a moment. Susan looked back at Robert. His expression had not changed. The machines continued their soft rhythm. "I don't know," she answered gently. "But maybe." The child nodded slowly, as if that answer was enough. A long stretch of silence followed again. The lamp flickered slightly as the electricity adjusted through the building's quiet nighttime circuits. Outside the window, clouds moved slowly across the sky, briefly dimming the glow of the city. Susan reached over and carefully picked up the watch from the table. It felt warm from the room's soft air. She held it for a moment, listening to the quiet ticking. Robert had worn that watch through countless moments. Film sets, interviews, family vacations, ordinary afternoons. It had measured so many hours of a life that had never moved in predictable directions. Tick, tick, tick. She placed it gently back beside the glasses. Across the room, one of the monitors flickered briefly before returning to its steady glow. A soft mechanical breath passed through the ventilator tubing. Robert remained still. Susan leaned closer once more, resting her forehead lightly near his arm. No dramatic words, no speeches. Just quiet presence. Outside, the night deepened further. The city lights continued shining. Cars moved. People somewhere laughed, talked, lived their lives without knowing about the small room on the upper floor of the hospital. Inside that room, the air remained calm and suspended between moments. The children watched their father. Susan held his hand. The watch on the table kept ticking softly, and beyond the glass window, the distant horizon slowly began to lighten, almost imperceptibly, as if the first hint of morning might eventually find its way through the dark.